Hello, my name's Rushton. I'm Executive Director of NMC Recordings, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first episode of NMC Listening Club. NMC is a charity, and we're enormously grateful for the support we receive from trusts and funders, including Arts Council of England, and from personal donations, to deliver our work supporting composers, building new audiences for new music, including through education resources and activities, and in spearheading talent development projects. NMC Listening Club is a way of staying connected with our supporters and audiences during the coronavirus pandemic lockdown. And I send all our very good wishes to you and yours, and hope you are staying safe and well. As with our pilot episode, when we looked at an album of work by Benjamin Britten, this episode will see us explore a landmark album from the NMC catalogue, with special guests who can shed a particular light on the works featured. This evening, we're joined by composer Emily Howard to discuss her album Magnetite, released as part of our debut disc series in 2016, along with pianist Alexandra Dariescu and mathematician, writer and presenter Marcus du Sautoy. Emily Howard has been described by BBC Music magazine as one of the most outstanding composers of her generation. Her music embraces a wide range of extra-musical influences, including science and mathematics, and her work relishes in exploring sound itself, responding to the musical forces for which she is writing. She has a growing catalogue of acclaimed and award-winning works written for Britain's leading ensembles, conductors and soloists. One of whom is Alexandra Dariescu, who premiered Emily's piano concerto, Mesmerism, in 2011. A gold medal graduate of the Royal Northern College of Music, Alexandra has toured extensively throughout Europe, Australia, China and the USA, including with innovative multimedia projects. As well as being a keen new music enthusiast, Marcus du Sautoy is the Simone Professor for the Public Understanding of Science at the University of Oxford. Alongside his many academic articles and lectures, he's written a series of popular books aimed at demystifying mathematics. A very warm welcome to you all. I'm going to hand over now to Emily, and I'll rejoin at the end of the conversation when I will be asking your questions. So if you would like to add your question to those which have been sent in advance, just type it in the YouTube live chat feature. You'll have to sign in to access that, and I'll pick it up at the end. Looking forward to seeing you later. Over to you, Emily.
Well, thanks for inviting me here. It's really wonderful to be doing this NMC Listening Club, and especially the first one. I feel really lucky. And here's my disc, Magnetite. It's an NMC debut disc. It was, I think, recorded around 2015-16. And honestly, I was so proud when it was being done. I mean, it's really something to have your own disc of your own music. And I'm so grateful to all of the performers who are on the disc, and also to NMC for enabling it all. And so today I've got Alexandra Dariescu and Marcus du Sautoy with me, both fabulous colleagues and friends, and it's going to be a pleasure to speak to both of them. I've known Alex, I've known you probably since we were at RNCM, Royal Northern College of Music, together far too long ago to mention. And then I've known Marcus more recently, probably since about 2015-16, when I was making this disc, we met up. Marcus, mathematician, we were discussing torus, a donut shape, and we were talking about that a lot, and we've got on ever since and done lots of work, although Marcus perhaps doesn't know as much about my earlier work, which is what we're going to discover today. So just a little bit about the disc. There are 6 pieces on it. 3 of them are orchestral from around 2007, 2011, and that seems like ages ago to me. And 3 of them are chamber from around 2015. And I'm going to start, the piece you heard in the opening was Magnetite, which is a piece for large orchestra that I wrote in 2007. And I wanted to begin with that, not only because it's the title track for the album, but also because it's a really important work for me. I remember that period because I'd just done the LSO Panophonik scheme, which is a wonderful experience. And I went straight into writing this piece for the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic. And it was a commission for the European Capital of Culture in 2008. And it was programmed alongside Beethoven 9. And I was really scared because it was going to open the Capital of Culture. And it was quite a pressure for me. So it's a really important piece in terms of really my first professional commission. And I do have a real love for the orchestra. And with this piece, not only was it the first kind of professional commission, but it was the first time I felt that I was able to put something about science into my work in a really meaningful way. And the way, so magnetite is the oldest known magnetic substance and the most magnetic of all naturally occurring minerals on Earth. And so somehow, I think my kind of working method crystallized. It's like looking into the structural and the physical properties of magnetite crystals, and also thinking about the myths, the human myths concerned with its magical powers. And I mean, it was called lodestone, and it used to act because people realized it could act as a compass if you made it into a certain shape and placed it on water. And so all of those things, along with thinking about magnetism, really led into the way I approached writing the piece. And I just wanted to play you a couple of excerpts. They're very much related to my thoughts about the magnetism at the time, because I was remembering, maybe Marcus as well, I was remembering those iron filings experiments from school. You know, the ones where, I mean, you've got the iron filings, you spread them all out, and then they go along the magnetic fields and they create beautiful shapes. And I was thinking very much about that when I was making this piece, and you'll hear this clip now where you hear a sort of real frenetic action and then a kind of explosion. And so for me, it's very much that the music is behaving magnetically in this very dynamic way. So we'll just listen to that now.
Exciting.
Does it sound like magnetism to you, Marcus?
Well, it's interesting because one of the strange things about magnetism, of course, is that it is quite a difficult thing to see. And of course, that's why it sort of took people some time to understand this kind of invisible force. I mean, you can see it because it attracts things, and so it causes this movement. Yet, and that's it's an interesting kind of image that you conjured up there with throwing the filing. Iron filings down, because to begin with, there is a lot of movement as the things get pulled around by the magnetic field, and then suddenly you have this stillness, which it is showing you those kind of lines. Those very classic, you have the bar magnet, and then the kind of lines around it, and suddenly you're seeing this kind of invisible force. I mean, it's a bit like many of the forces are rather strange. Gravity as well, hard to see gravity. Yet it is a very physical thing. So it's intriguing. Could I hear the magnetism? Is then a really interesting question, because you're asking me to change my. Usually we use our eyes so much for trying to understand things, and here's something which. It's quite, unvisual. So maybe you're right. Maybe sound is the right way to approach what this kind of strange force field is. But yeah, I mean, it's always kind of interesting for me with music, because often there's, it's the beginning of the journey, which is the concept of magnetism, the dynamism of things moving towards each other, those lines, and then when the piece comes out, of course, are you expecting us to hear magnetism inside there? How important is that? I mean, it's
that's
a
$1 million question. Yeah, no. To be perfectly honest, not at all. It's almost like because I think people really enjoy hearing about creative processes, and this is mine. But I do think, first of all, I'm sure you could arrive at the same kind of sounds via perhaps a completely different thought process. But I also think, because music is so abstract, I think that you take your experiences of life and then you hear a piece, and that makes you think of other things. And I think if I wasn't telling you about magnetism, you wouldn't necessarily think about it. What do you think, Alex?
Well, I'm fascinating to hear about the journey into the crystal, because as a performer, I love storytelling, I love images. So it's fantastic when you get that from the composer, from the creator of the piece. And I'd love to know a little bit more about this journey, and how you use the game of contrasts, which, of course, you've got throughout your works. And I'm just fascinated about that.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, well, I had that kind of response, which was a very dynamic response. But you're right that I love contrasts in my music. And another response, there's another excerpt that I could play, and it very much shows like a still version of the kind of magnetic idea. And what I was thinking about, I mean, there's another, again, perhaps Marcus can explain this much more eloquently than me, but like the idea of a solenoid. And it's almost like I took a chord, a very consonant, beautiful, harmonic sounding, lush chord, and I put it inside. In my head, I put it inside this solenoid, and I was trying very hard to imagine if you've got objects and hypothetically these musical events, and that they would be attracting and repelling each other with like magnets, and how that would make the music sound. So I think in Magnetite you can't necessarily hear that. I mean, it's just that I wouldn't have been able to write it had I not been thinking about it. Let's listen to this very still version, and you'll hear these verticals, and they kind of hopefully having some kind of pull on each other. so Alex, I was thinking that's probably towards the center, if you like, of this journey. You know, I suppose I do like to feel that I'm traveling somewhere. And I usually choose an abstract kind of place as well. So a shape, crystal.
Yes, I'm interested. Yeah. You mentioned the word crystal, and interestingly, you mentioned crystallizing the ideas as well. But I mean, that seemed to be also a key idea that you were looking at, just not just the macro idea of magnetism and its effect on its environment, but looking inside the magnetite. And of course, the molecules, the atoms line up in a very sort of interesting symmetrical way. So is that something that you also explored, the actual structure inside, and how did you do that? How did you explore the kind of symmetrical kind of lattice that is at the heart of magnetite?
You know, I did look at it, and I would say I didn't explore it in the depth that I would do now. You know, I would say that I looked at it, and it was so, how can I explain it? I wasn't so able to take something like that, I think, 15 years ago and do something that I would want to do with it musically. So that's why I would say, I mean, if we compare it with some later works, you know, this is very much, I've got like a few snippets of ideas that I'm doing. So the magnetic ideas come out, and the kind of journey between them. You know, I remember I was just trying out as well some ideas with timing. You know, like an exponential timing, so that you'd go through something, and instead of it being very regular, you'd have it so that it gets increasingly slower very rapidly, or increasingly faster very rapidly. And I'm really interested in this kind of idea. I suppose it just takes a bit of time to take an idea, which I love to do from science, like a structural idea or a shape or a process, and then to find ways that satisfy you aesthetically or creatively, and to put them on a page or into music. So I don't actually think I can't actually say, or maybe I couldn't even remember what I did with this crystal, although I've got some diagrams of it, you know, and I really studied it, and I just don't think that it's immediate.
It's very interesting. I actually looked up some pictures of magnetite before we started this conversation, and I was quite struck. There are some extraordinary examples where usually you can't see the micro symmetrical structure of these, at the way these atoms get put together. But if you have magnetite, which is sort of formed in an environment where there isn't too much disturbance, which destroys the structure as it builds, you can actually see macro versions of these microcrystals. So they and I went once, actually, it wasn't magnetite, but another crystal. We went deep down inside a mine in Germany, and they discovered this cave where these cubic crystals, I think they were just salt actually, but they'd actually formed extraordinarily large, perfect cubes, because deep down underground, there wasn't any kind of natural disturbance, such that the crystal, as it grew, just maintained this symmetrical structure that you generally can't see. And suddenly you had kind of massive, large, perfect cubes. And I think there's some examples of that with magnetite as well, which was kind of interesting.
I'm going to have to come back to you later about that, Marcus, because I was thinking that's my NMC second disc. You know, I can see taking bits of magnetism, the music, and growing them like a crystal.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting you mentioned the idea of exponential growth. And often I think, you know, I spend a lot of time, and that's why we got together, talking to creative artists, because I find time and again the structures that I'm interested in as a mathematician, as a scientist, are often ones that resonate for a composer or a visual artist. And I think often the sort of common strand for both of us is that we're trying to understand things in the natural world around us. And you've got your particular language of music, and I have mine of mathematics. And somehow the reason they resonate for both of us or us as a society is that we're tapping into trying to understand how our world works. And an exponential growth, of course, is one that's a little bit too topical at the moment with the coronavirus and the idea that, something can start very small but ramp up very quickly, and having ways to experience that I think is quite important. Actually, I'm just watching The Luminaries on BBC at the moment, and that's a very interesting example where a novelist took this idea of exponential growth and tried to embed it as a structure in her book. Eleanor Catton's book starts with a huge, great big part, and then she halves the chapters until you get this racing towards the end. And it's really interesting to see kind of these mathematical structures used to create extraordinarily unusual dynamic kind of journeys within like a book or in a piece of music.
Yeah, sorry, Alex, were you going to add something about the exponential performer?
No, I was just going to say that I find it so fascinating in your work, Emily, because it's so structured. And with Magnetite, when you hear the whole piece, it's got such a wonderful arch, and the journey that you were talking about in the dynamic fragment that we've heard, it's so dangerous and it's got so much energy and tension in it. And then in the static illustration, it's just as exactly what you said, we've reached the destination and it's just all of this massive space that you fill with such beautiful sound and all the colors that you got in your writing. And it's fantastic. It's exactly what Marcus was referring to as well.
Thanks so much, Alex. I was saying, I've got a very, very different piece that I'd love to play now on the album, and it's called Threnos. It's another example of this idea of exponential functions sort of influencing, particularly the timing in my music. And I tell you what, I'm just going to play it before we say anything about it. So just the first 30 seconds or so. And so that's performed by, so it's two voices, mezzo-soprano Lucy Goddard and bass Simon Whiteley. And I worked really closely with them, actually, on making this piece. And they've done an amazing job. It's really very tough and difficult. And I was deeply interested in the idea of this kind of just a burst of energy that you hear, this kind of, I call it like a violent upheaval, with the bass voice reaching falsetto as well. So sometimes you can't tell who is singing. That was the idea of it. And it's somewhere between, you don't know who's singing what, and they're kind of splitting. So there's a real chaotic feel in that sense. But also the timing of it very, very quickly becomes incredibly slow. And that is due to this exponential function feel I have behind it. I realize it in quite a free way, this piece. Not always in all pieces, but with this one, it's very free, but absolutely behind it is this structure. And I love that the way that particularly a kind of exponential rallentando draws you in. It really does. It draws you in. It's like, it's very important to my music, all these exponential things, for those sudden changes that Alex was talking about. But yeah, I don't know if you heard that or...
I did. And what I find fascinating is that your writing is so precise. And I know from Mesmerism, as we'll speak a bit later on, there's a lot of detail in the score. And I just found it fascinating with this piece that you allowed the freedom for singers to choose the length of the notes. That was one. And perhaps my second question on this piece is, how did you get to using no lyrics? Well, by using voices.
Yeah. Again, I suppose it's because this one it felt like a really abstract exploration of these voices. Very much it was the sound of the the bass and the soprano together and at different, that was what the sort of real inspiration behind the piece, as well as a few others there's a line from Shakespeare's metaphorical poem called The Phoenix and the Turtle, and it's two distincts, division none. And I find that just, when you think about that, I mean, there are many, many layers that you can speak about that forever, but just two distincts, division none, and how that works with these voices. And then kind of, rather than being focused on text, it's focused on these, so the proximity, the register of the voices, but also these timings. The one timing that I've spoken about was this exponential RAL, but there's also, I think at the time, I think it was 2015, and I was working closely. I had a Leave for Hume artist in residence at the maths department in Liverpool, which gave me a chance. I mean, I have a master degree, but it's sort of many, many years since then. And this just gave me a chance to speak quite regularly with mathematicians. And I was chatting about dynamical systems a lot and chaos theory and bringing some of that into my music. I'll play you a clip in a moment. The one I'll play in a moment, Leviathan. I worked with Joshua Hyde, who's a saxophonist, and Noam Beerstone, percussionist, again, really closely. Learned a lot from them about how to make, baritone split tones and cymbal multiphonics. We spent ages melding them to get this language. But then I kind of put this through a dynamical system. And I know, Marcus, we've got, what's that, the quote, the flap of the butterfly's wings in Brazil. What is it again?
Well, I mean, dynamical systems, why they're so difficult for mathematicians is because very small changes can cause huge differences in the outcome, which I think is what is so fascinating about them, because they're then, although they're deterministic, so, you put the same thing, you'll get the same thing out, but make a small change. And this is the idea of the butterfly. So a classic dynamical system, which is very sensitive to small changes, is our weather. So this led to the idea that a butterfly could flap its wings in Brazil and cause a hurricane in Hong Kong. And so I think these dynamical systems are really fascinating, first of all, because, again, we got this idea that they're really the way that nature behaves is controlled by these dynamical systems. And one of the reasons nature looks so wild and chaotic is that it's mathematically chaotic. So, but I think that, that's a fascinating thing for any creative, is that you can have a very simple rule which yet can give rise to huge complexity. And I think those are always fascinating, because when you listen to something, I think what often happens is the brain, I think this is why there's a big connection between mathematics and music, because the brain is kind of challenged with what's going on here. What's the kind of, this isn't just randomness. Music is not noise. There's some structure in there. What is the structure? And you try to start to reverse engineer a little bit. Even if you're not doing it consciously, I think subconsciously the brain is looking for those patterns and things. And why a dynamical system is so fascinating, a chaotic one, is that it's really difficult to reverse engineer what's going on. Yet there's some sort of rule behind it, and that rule can be remarkably simple. So something like the Mandelbrot set, which is this fractal, has a very simple rule, yet produces something with infinite complexity. You zoom in on this thing, it never simplifies. You see repeats of things and then new structures, yet it's all generated by a very simple rule. So I think that's such an exciting kind of piece of mathematics, I think, for any creative artist.
I completely enjoyed learning and working on it. And I think, in this piece, again, so you've got something unpredictable to work against. And for me, it's almost like my creative process is making that unpredictability, to knowing it really well in my mind as I write. It was unpredictable, and I could never have come up with that myself. And then I'm making stuff predictable in it. But also, there's something chaotic about these sounds that that Josh and Noam were making. The split tones, it doesn't necessarily always happen, or the multiphonics. You can sometimes get some kind of pitch, but you could not get it reliably. And it was really interesting to try. Like, I've written a passage, I'm going to play it now. Again, this is one of these very quiet, central moments where you're just, I think there's a split tone going on, but you can also hear, I think Noam is brushing the cymbal and trying to get particular pitches out of it, but you can't be sure what they'll be. But it's quite exciting. So here it is, a center bit of Leviathan. So, moving on, I think we should speak with Alex about Mesmerism. Speaking of another close collaboration. So Mesmerism is my work. It's for solo piano and chamber orchestra. And I wrote it in 2011 for the Liverpool Mozart Orchestra and Mark Heron in their Diamond Jubilee year. And I mean, again, Alex, I mean, do you want to play a little bit of it, or? Yeah, and we'll just play the opening.
Okay.
Thank you. So, I mean, it's one of a number of works that's inspired by the life and work of Ada Lovelace. So I admire her ability to think creatively. I mean, she was a mathematician in the 19th century, and she didn't live long, unfortunately, and she perhaps didn't have all the opportunities of her male colleagues to have like a career and do lots of work. But what she was amazing at was taking sort of new ideas and then just literally thinking of something. And she was always experimenting with these. So she dabbled with mesmerism, which was a forerunner of hypnosis, developed by the 18th century German physician Franz Mesmer. And I suppose my work just takes from that. It's like it's about the piano mesmerizing the orchestra, and you can hear Alex at the beginning with that sort of. And Alex, I mean, do you want to tell us something about the experience of working on it?
It was a wonderful experience, and I mean, after we became friends, you started coming to a lot of my concerts, and I came to a lot of your premieres, and I think that sort of got us to this wonderful collaboration that, for me, being part of this process was just so interesting and so fascinating. And I was so grateful for the opportunity because I could see you at work. And we met a few times during a few months while you were in the process of composing this piece. And it was great to see the progress and how you were going and where you were going.
I remember it took quite a long time, actually. I found it a very difficult piece to write, partly because it's really hard to write. I think a piano concerto is just, there's such a lot of weight on the word. And I don't think of it as a concerto as such, because and people have said this, it's very like almost not a piano concerto, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, it feels very much like a dialogue between the piano and the orchestra, and it feels as if you've got this sort of velvety balloon that you pass from the soloist to the orchestra. So even in the first bit that you've seen and you heard, it's very much sort of, it sounds improvised, although Emily's writing is just so precise, because it says senza misura, so there's no measure, but then she says 11 seconds. So this is a very interesting thing for me as a performer, and perhaps this would be a question for you both about the notion of timing in music, because on many occasions, myself, when I'm on stage, I just lose track of time completely. Sometimes I feel the orchestra or the conductor is playing a lot slower than I would like them to do, or vice versa. So that notion of time goes out of the window. And I was just thinking, how do you explain it from a scientific point of view, and how does timing work in science?
Well, it's very interesting because, I think mathematics almost grew out of that challenge of trying to understand time, because trying to pin down what time is actually really challenging. You get into a lot of kind of circular arguments. It's the thing that my watch keeps track of, but that doesn't really make sense. But it is, for me, at the heart of it is about patterns, because you start to recognize the passage of time when you see something repeating. And then that gives you your kind of measure. So whether it be, ancient civilizations, of course, it was repeating things like the sun coming up, or the cycle of the moon, which allowed you to understand the concept of a month, or the repetition of the seasons, or the first clocks were the idea of they would take water dripping, and that would give you the regularity. So in fact, one of the very first kind of pieces of art, if you go to the caves in Lascaux and you see all those amazing pictures of animals kind of running across the walls, but there is in fact there a sequence of dots which is clearly a kind of pattern to I think quarters of the moon, and it's actually a calendar, and the calendar is helping you to understand when to hunt for animals and things. So that concept of time, it disappears unless you have something, I think, which is repeating. So I think that's your kind of measure. Is it something against your heartbeat versus something external? So then when you've got two different measures of time, you've got a chance to know fast or slow. But I mean, one of the interesting things is this psychological state of flow, which you probably, as a performer, that's, I think, something absolutely you described, this idea that you lose time when you're actually sort of immersed in something really challenging, yet something which you have the skills to do. And that's the moment. I mean, I get it in mathematics very rarely, but those moments when I will come out and say, oh my gosh, the day has gone, and I've just been in this sense of flow. And that's really interesting, because it kind of disrupts that psychological state, disrupts where you are. But you must have to always be in control, or do you give up that control to, say, the conductor to help you through that time? It's very interesting.
I think it's very important to be in dialogue with everyone, and this is just managing that awareness as well. And sometimes you can't be that stubborn, because you have to admit that it might be your pulse that's going a little bit more racy than it should be. So it's just that constant dialogue, yeah, for sure.
And I'm interested, Emily, that, because Ada Lovelace, of course, my first thoughts with Ada Lovelace is to do with her idea of creating code. She went along to see this extraordinary machine that Charles Babbage had made. Her mother was very good at taking her to see the scientific experiments of the day, really pushing this young woman to her education. But she starts to think of interesting things this machine can do. And in the notes that she writes, she has this wonderful speculation, maybe it'd be able to compose elaborate pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. And so it's interesting you chose her thoughts about mesmerism and hypnotism rather than being drawn towards something perhaps more obviously musical and mathematical and to the idea of code.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in fact I have done both. So there are other pieces. You see, I have taken, in fact, there's a kind of trilogy in 2011. So Mesmerism is one of them. I was really reading a lot about her, including reading those notes that she wrote. So I wrote a piece first, and Ada Sketches, and it's all about that, taking that, exactly that idea. And then I also wrote a piece called, it was the calculus of the nervous system. That's another idea she had. And that was an orchestral piece for, how the brain would give rise to thoughts and nerves to feelings. And so what I love about those ideas that she had is they spring up amazing images, and then I'm very free to do other things. Because I think one of the important things that I take, I take ideas as catalysts from science, but I also take processes as well. But I do tend to take a lot of things together, and it's actually the clashing of many different ideas from different sources together that really is of great interest to me. That's what I like to do. So more than just, say, translating one thing, it's more take this from this field or these extra musical things, clash them together, come up with something else, and try to come up with a unity from sort of madness. Or
it's very, very interesting, because it's exactly my process in mathematics, that I find I'm most creative when I go to a seminar in a completely different field and I see their particular way of looking at the world, perhaps the questions, and I'm realizing, oh my gosh, but that's something that I can apply in my own area. So and actually I've just wrote a book recently, The Creativity Code, which is about, can code be creative? And in there, there's an interesting theory about three different sorts of creativity. One of them is kind of exploratory creativity, which is kind of pushing the rules of the game to the extreme. I would say someone like Bach is doing that. And then this idea of combinational creativity, which I think is the one that you just described and the one I use a lot in my mathematics, which is, taking themes which don't have really obviously anything to do with each other and combining those. And then there's transformational creativity, which is kind of thinking outside the box, coming up with something completely new. But
see, I think Ada Lovelace is kind of good at that. Yeah. I was going to say it would be lovely to just play a little bit of Alex with the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra and conducted by Andrew Gourlay on this NMC disc, just so you can hear what happens to the chords that she played just before. So here is just a middle passage where very much the piano is beginning to mesmerize the orchestra. So yeah, that's Mesmerism. We just move on to a couple more pieces, just a couple of short clips, because time is flying with the conversation with you two. There are two more pieces on the album, and one of them is a string quartet, Afferents, and that was again another chamber piece written around 2014-15 for the Elias String Quartet. And it links well with the Ada Lovelace thing, because just to read a little about afferents, it's a physiological term describing how the brain receives signals from the body, how blood moves through vessels towards organs, and how nerve fibers convey sensory experience to the central nervous system. So you can see not a million miles away from the kind of really imagined calculus of the nervous system I was thinking about before. And with this one, when I was composing it, I was concerned with like how and when we become conscious of sensory information, things we touch, see, hear, and how this might sound. And it's all really imaginary. And I love thinking about stuff like this. And actually, there are two movements. Very much the first movement about, I often do this to think about it as though I'm in or the structure and thinking about how it moves from like on the ground, if you like, or in. And then the second movement is very much more from this view, like objectively looking at the whole of the structure. And I like to do that because it helps me I love to find different ways to view material that I'm working with. And I often do this, have different views. I know I very much like the poetry of Geoffrey Hill, and there's a phrase called neurocratic hope. And I think he made the word neurocratic up, but I just love that idea. And I think that very much influences as well this kind of imaginary, afferents traveling towards some kind of neural network that is. So this excerpt you're about to hear is really icy. It's really kind of like synapses working, and but this is the opening of the second movement, which is very much the kind of objective view.
It's so brilliant. And this bit actually reminded me a little bit of Le Jeu de Contraire, the prelude by Henri Dutilleux, because it's all about the game of contraries and the game of contrast that you always use in your music. This is just so apparent and wonderful in this performance. It's the Elias Quartet, yes? Yeah.
No, the Elias Quartet, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, they really... it's kind of everything. I think it's also, this is incredibly meticulously timed, like everything. There were 4 sort of lines rhythmically, and everything's coming towards, and very much towards harmonies, and coming away and closer towards them. And there are many quarter tones as well, blurring things. So sometimes, but I think it's probably really hard to play, and I'm very grateful for the performance, which was wonderful. And it just, but for me, it was very much an otherworldly kind of feel inside. Anyway.
It's very interesting, the kind of the scientific ideas that you mentioned that feed into that piece. I mean, I think there are things I've been thinking quite a lot about. I wrote a book called What We Cannot Know, the challenges of science that seem to be really perhaps things that will always be beyond us. And I think one of the most exciting was trying to understand consciousness. And there you're kind of mentioning the idea of when do you become conscious of certain things, although your eyes might be receiving all the visual information, your brain processes it and makes you aware of some things and not others, the important things or not, or the really weird illusions where there's something called the Necker cube, where you can make the cube sort of sit one way and then you look at it and then it's sort of sticking out the other way, yet the data hasn't changed. And I think what's very interesting with music is and the ear is how we focus, on one thing and then we come out of focus and listen to another thing. And just imagine that, you're at that party and the conversations, and it's very difficult to hear two conversations at the same time. Yet in music, there you've got four voices. They're talking to each other and sometimes against each other. And I've always thought, the idea of a fugue is a real challenge, because there you've got these multiple voices. One starts talking and then it's going off, and then you hear the second voice coming in and it's saying the first thing but delayed in time. And your brain, it's a real challenge to kind of negotiate these multiple voices going on. So I think, music by its very nature is offering you that challenge of, what are you conscious of now in this sound world? Especially you've got four voices in there in the quartet, but listening to an orchestra, how your brain unpicks that and makes it sort of multidimensional, or is it sort of I think it's very, very interesting, this sort of investigation of the brain when it's listening to music.
And I find it the same with, this is very much, Marcus, like orchestral awareness. I had a fascinating talk with Steve Potter, one of the leading UK psychotherapists, and he was talking about orchestral awareness rather than relation awareness. And it's very much when you are on stage, so myself as a soloist working with the conductor and the orchestra, it's very much being in dialogue with all of these different people, the same as in a party. You're trying to pay attention to the person talking to you, trying to think what you're going to say. You listen to another conversation. It's always in dialogue with so many different people. And I think this is what makes us incredible human beings, because we've got these abilities to connect different relationships. And when we orchestrate our view on the world, then it's got such a huge impact. And Steve was writing this book, which I think is coming out in a couple of weeks, Therapy with a Map. And I know from my conversations with Emily in the past that it's very much we all have some sort of map in our head, whether we're writing or we're creating or our list of contacts. And it's very much about picking the important words and the important things. And this is how we orchestrate our lives.
I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think, just speaking to, we all do have a kind of map, and from the listener as well, or from maybe even from a mathematician who's inspired some of my stuff, or from actually my map, and they're all probably quite different. What do you think? I mean, they all have a really different look, probably, or focus.
Well, it's interesting, of course. I mean, I'm interested as a composer whether sometimes the kind of notation that one uses to map out music becomes a horribly limiting factor. That music is this massively high-dimensional shape, yet somehow you've got to produce a two-dimensional geometry on the page which represents that shape, and that's do you find you're inventing new notation in order to be able to map what's in your head, because you find just the way to project it down onto this piece of paper, it just is missing things?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I do not as much as some composers, but composers are always inventing new notation. And I always think, I think it's good to invent new notation when you need it to describe something absolutely different and in a clearer way, perhaps. But I also think that in a way, that's a joy, because somehow there's a lot left for the performers to do. Do you see what I mean? Like there's this kind of two-dimensional map, certainly in notated music, that you create, but it comes alive and in different ways with different performers. And I think that for me is the most exciting thing about writing for live musicians and live performance, the fact that you've got this kind of instructions, but in fact they can be interpreted in different ways. I love that. Yeah. So perhaps that's a great place for us to end, because I know time has flown. But I mean, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this chat. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the final excerpt from the sixth piece on the album, and then we can finish. So it's called Solar, and it takes us right back to where we were beginning, because in fact I wrote it in 2010 for the London Symphony Orchestra, and it's also concerned with magnetism, and it's kind of this time it was my response to the kind of science and stories behind the sun's strong solar magnetic field. So it's a very short work, but I'm going to just play a minute or so to finish our conversation. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. That was a fascinating conversation. Great to get an insight into the amazing creative processes and scientific processes that go in. We've had quite a few questions come in, so I'm going to dive straight in and see if we can get through as many as possible. The first was a general question around the whole connectivity between music and science and maths. Around the work that Emily and Marcus have been doing with Prism in Manchester. And I wondered if you could perhaps just fill us in a little bit about that exciting initiative and the work that's coming out of that. Emily?
Well, so Prism is at the Royal Northern College of Music. It's the Centre for Practice and Research in Science and Music, directed by myself and Marcus. We're lucky that Marcus is an honorary visiting professor at the RNCM. So now, I suppose we've just said it, we've recently been awarded a grant from Research England, Expanding Excellence in England, and it's allowed us to expand and have a team. And we had just opened a wonderful Prism lab at the RNCM when, of course, lockdown happened. So we're kind of very excited to get back there. Mathematicians, scientists, composers, performers, all working together. It's kind of the collaborative process is important, as is important as the research that comes out and the music and science.
Yeah, it's been a really exciting project to be part of. And I mean, it's sort of indulging me because when I was younger, I kind of made this choice between going the mathematical route or, I was a trumpet player and I did flirt with perhaps going the musical route. So it's really lovely to be able to bring these two together again and kind of explore all those connections that I've kind of been obsessed with for years, but to share it with composers and performers. I mean, the Royal Northern College of Music is the most extraordinary place. I mean, I always come away from workshops there incredibly energized. But we're exploring a really interesting range of things. We explored the idea of proof in mathematics being a little bit like musical composition and seeing the connections there. We're looking at artificial intelligence, what role that's playing. I just wrote a book about
artificial intelligence in the creative arts, and many more things, climate change, making new instruments. But yeah, it's a really exciting project.
Brilliant. It's interesting because someone's asked a question about AI. Is that development of technology, is that something that might influence your compositional styles and approaches and techniques, Emily, going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd say it already is through my colleagues. So just in Prism itself, colleagues of mine, Sam Salem and Christopher Meelan, have launched Prism Sample RNN, which is it's an audio synthesis technique using artificial intelligence, machine learning. And actually, I am going to write a new string quartet, or I'm writing this year, and I'm going to be using that within the creative process. So absolutely, yeah, having a great effect.
Yeah, because I read that you'd written some string quartet miniatures, which was something about if composition could be a mathematical proof.
Yeah, absolutely. Working with Marcus, it's called 4 Musical Proofs and a Conjecture, written for the Piatti String Quartet. And Marcus and I worked on it through a project with New Scientist Live called The Music of Proof.
Fascinating, brilliant. And on that subject of working with artists, obviously the way, Emily, you've worked with Alex very closely on Mesmerism. Someone posed a question about whether that compositional process, how influenced the final work was by Alex and her playing and her style. And, you mentioned that how you got to know each other and become friends. Did that massively impact the final piece?
I think it always does, and definitely with Alex. I mean, Alex, I was thinking we had spent quite a bit of time together when you were playing through pieces, particularly the Mozart to me. I think it makes a huge difference to work with a performer, and actually whoever you're collaborating with, that person and your interactions, I think, really influences your work. I mean, with scientists and performers, definitely. Mm. And with the piece, I mean, there's something very, those kind of mesmeric passages. I think the sort of fluid way that Alex plays, the kind of really, I think that absolutely influenced the piece. The really fast, very quick and sort of delicate way of playing definitely was a massive influence on the piece.
Yeah. And from your point of view, Alex, do you find that you, when you approach working with a composer like Emily, you sort of try and immerse yourself in other composers' works, or you mentioned Mozart, the influence of Mozart, or do you sort of try and keep removed from that so that you can have a kind of a clear musical palette, if you like?
Well, it was just wonderful working with Emily, and I remember she came a few times in Liverpool. I played Shostakovich too, I think, and I think Emily heard me play a lot of Chopin as well, and of course the Mozart Concerto, the 488, the second movement. That's what the chords are based on, and it was just fascinating, the whole process. And of course, Emily was the first composer I worked with on such a great piece. And I was remembering the process of giving the premiere, which was with the Liverpool Mozart Orchestra and Mark Heron, and then recording it a few years later with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic and Andrew Gourlay. And it was such a different experience, both unique, but in the first, for the premiere, of course, you couldn't hear any recording. I had no idea how it was going to sound with the whole orchestra. And that is, for me, one of the most wonderful things, that we're creating it there after Emily created the whole piece, but us musicians on stage afterwards. And of course there is that pressure as well. We're trying to make the piece justice, and we're a lot more nervous because the creator, the composer, is there. But it was just so wonderful, the whole process. And of course to have it on an actual disc, to have it recorded on NMC was just brilliant.
Yeah, great. It's very interesting. You talked a lot in your earlier discussion, obviously, about structures. You talked about the crystals and so on. And we've had a question in from Jerry for you, Alex, which is: do you want the composer to reveal the structure or the inner workings of the piece to you, or do you want to discover that yourself? To sort of, I suppose, unveil that yourself as a performer. Sort of like the story of the piece.
Brilliant question. Hello, Jerry. I think the more information, the better it is for me as a performer. Mm-hmm. I have very much been taught by all my very distinguished teachers that the score is the Bible, and you look at every single detail. And of course, with past composers, you can't ask them what did they mean and how did they mean it. Mm-hmm. So this was just the most wonderful thing that I could ask Emily any question. And as I was saying earlier, there's a lot of freedom in the piece. But Emily is incredibly detailed with how she writes things. For example, the dynamics. There's so many differences between 4 pianissimos and 2, and you get to those, as we're talking about contrasts, within 2 bars. You get from PPPP to fortissimo and back. So it's incredible. It really showcases the spectrum of the piano and the versatility of the instrument.
Interesting. And Marcus, do you think that those sort of mathematical, scientific sort of impetuses to Emily's work, do you think knowledge or understanding of those is important or essential for the audience, for the listener?
Yeah, this is something.
Some of it's pretty complex stuff, isn't it?
We've talked about this a lot, actually, because many of these structures are weirdly atemporal. They're outside of time. They're things perhaps which are, you can see on the page, the score. Take a simple example like the symmetries that Bach uses in variation. You can see the symmetry in the kind of physical notes on the page, but to hear it is a little bit more challenging. If you take something like Haydn's Palindrome Symphony, was Haydn expecting you to hear the thing, repeat backwards? Because that's quite difficult to listen to. Or was it just that he'd run out of manuscript paper and he had to say, okay, well, just play it backwards now or something? So I think, there's a lot which, again, I think it comes back to something that I mentioned in our conversation, which is the brain is continually trying to decode what's going on. And so even if the person isn't aware of it, if there is structure there, I think it's really satisfying. That's the brain enjoys the structure, even if it isn't entirely conscious of it. So I think that's often the role is to frame things, and then once you're immersed in it and you listen to it again and again, new things appear of that structure. It's almost like it's a very high dimensional thing, as I mentioned. And you get to see little shadows of it, and gradually, as you listen more and more, those shadows get put together, and you start to get a feeling for what is going on. But I think very often it'd be very difficult for somebody to articulate these structures without being told.
And Emily, would it be true to say that obviously there's the structural inspiration of these mathematical scientific concepts, but then presumably, and obviously as a mathematician yourself, that sort of love of maths, does it sort of engender kind of emotions that you want to portray in the music as well? It's not just sort of technical structural stuff.
For me, they're not so separated, but I think that I think what I love about maths, the kind of shapes and processes and patterns, but definitely I think you could describe, I'm making kind of big structures but in those are sort of thoughts about all manner of everything, the whole of my experience. So that would be what I'm reading, my life and what I've learned in orchestration and what I've spoken to with my people the day before, the whole lot. And often it's clashing all of these ideas together that makes something exciting for me. But I do like to have some process that I put in place to react against. That's really usually quite important for me. So that there's a structure there, but not as a very strict thing, but just something so that then it almost allows me to go after that.
I think there's a really important point in here, which is you mentioned the word emotion. And I think people get very worried when we talk about music and maths that somehow we're stripping the music of its emotional side. And I
always try and stress that, no, it's the other way around. I want you to understand that mathematics is highly emotional. The reaction to structure is very often accompanied with a huge surge of a kind of emotional recognition. And that's, I think, why we explore this idea of proof. A proof is a story. It's a narrative. It has moments of tension, moments of total revelation, of surprise, twists and turns. And that's why I think proofs are highly emotional. It isn't just it can't just be true. It's got to move you as well. And that's why I think we were really interested in, well, the proofs that we've come up with as mathematicians are amazing journeys. Do they have a kind of musical resonance to them?
And you talked earlier about the rules that are involved in this. I mean, we know many composers who use rules. I know Max use it, and golden triangles and Fibonacci series and all this sort of thing. Are there examples that applies equally to other art forms? I think you mentioned that earlier, Marcus, that was an interest to you also.
Yes, it's very interesting. I mean, I suppose because music is a more abstract art form than the visual, which we and I think the written word as well. It allows one to play much more interesting sort of games. You've got more freedom because does music mean anything? Whilst a written word really has a lot of association of meaning. But I think, I had that example of Eleanor Catton, her book, The Luminaries, uses a mathematical structure. But, one of my favorite writers is Borges. He loved playing with kind of mathematical ideas in his short stories, and certainly the visual as well. I mentioned fractals. Well, actually, they're a way of understanding, for example, Jackson Pollock's work, that what Jackson Pollock is doing with his drip painting is not, it's quite hard to reproduce. It's something very special. He's creating this fractal geometry in paint, which again is resonating with the fractals of nature. It's a very abstract version of nature that Pollock's producing. So I think there are a lot of rules, sometimes which an artist deliberately follows, sometimes which are intuitively sort of discovered by the artist, and that's what's so exciting, to see an artist hone in on a structure sort of intuitively, and then for me to recognize, well, that's something I'm really fascinated in from a mathematical point of view. Messiaen, for example, discovered an extraordinary high-dimensional symmetrical shape in one of his piano pieces, and it's absolutely clear he could never have known about that. Yet for me, when I see these two 12-tone rows, how they interact, it generates the most extraordinary symmetry in high-dimensional space. But amazing. He came to it purely for the aesthetics of how these two 12-tone rows interact with each other.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we've been thinking about that from the point of view of a composer creating work using these stimuli or structures. But of course, then it directly relates back to the performer, Alex, and perhaps how you maybe reflect on those things to help you with your interpretation and portraying that to the audience. Is that something that you would use as a approach?
For sure. And I think what Marcus was saying about meaning, and music is abstract, is very true, and music is very subjective because it can mean so many different things to so many different people. And from the point of view of a performer that has just received a score, as we've done with Mesmerism, of course, Emily had her whole conception and idea about the piece, and my aim was to put that into my own playing, but in the same time, it's about interpreting the piece. So the score is the Bible, but then it gives me as a performer the freedom to rethink it, to recreate it in my own way. And I think this is why music is eternal. And in classical music, you will never get the same interpretation of the same piece. And that's the beauty of music.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We've had another question in on the subject of time, and obviously that in itself is a scientific mathematical concept. But there's a question about whether how the length of a piece or the timing of a piece, how important that is in a fact, how important a factor that is in the architecture of a piece when you're writing. Is that something you're conscious of, Emily, when you're, I don't know, how do you do? Do you sort of draft out a sort of skeleton plan of the work? Do you know?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It matters a lot to me. I think it matters to me because what I'm doing is so controlled in terms of timing for me. You know, as I said, I think I said that I actually like to think of a very strict structure, and then I know that the performer will put another layer of freedom on that, or at least I'm calculating for a layer of freedom for the performer to do what they like with, in a way. And I like that. But for me, you know, I suppose I also think about the whole thing as some kind of dynamical system. So I'm not the kind of composer that usually composes into nowhere. I usually know what's happening everywhere, and if I change this little bit, then I might change that bit as well. You know, so I think of it as the whole thing is some kind of dynamical system, really, or, you know, move this little bit. That's how it works for me. It's different for everyone, I think.
Sure. We're back to butterfly wings, I think.
I think we are, yeah.
There's an interesting question that's come in around the space in which you work, and actually the question could be applied to each of you equally. You know, so to Emily, you know, where do you tend to do your composing? Does that space influence your approach to your work?
I think it probably does, because I'm sure everything that we do influences everything we do. But I mean, you can't see it here, but I have like a kind of architect's board to write on. And I really I love sketching diagrams, and, you know, I'm always using this pencil to do lots of stuff. And then I've got a computer, and then I've got this piano, you know, so I'm on a swivelly chair like that. So I suppose I'm just doing that the whole time. I can see Marcus is reading a lot and Alex is playing a lot. Alex got proper piano.
This is my kind of canvas of choice. So I'm slightly autistic on having to write on yellow notepads. And this is my workspace. I mean, I do a lot. You know, lockdown is my life anyway. I live my life in lockdown, which is, you know, I sit in my office. This is my office at home, and this is, you know, my perfect environment for working. I mean, it's surrounded by my books, and it's kind of my home has always been important for me, for being kind of a safe place to go exploring mentally.
Marvelous. And we have actually had a question in about the guitar that's on the wall behind you. Is that for aesthetic purposes, or is it?
That's my midlife crisis. That's my midlife crisis. No, I mean, I learned trumpet when I was a student, but recently, actually, I've been trying to learn the cello. One of the hardest things about lockdown has been not being able to play live music together. So I formed a quartet where we're playing the Borodin string quartet at the moment, which is what's on over here. We've just started to go and play out in the streets. In one of the quartets lives in a dead end street. So and it was just such a joy to come back again. We so tried to play using some sort of across the internet, but latency just kills things. You can't Zoom a quartet.
No. And in terms of live performance, and obviously the current situation, Alex, of course, that's hugely impacted your life. I must say thank you so much for sharing some live performance with us this evening. That was a real treat. And I think of all creatives, you know, our thoughts are very much with those that have had to sort of temporarily turn away from the concert platform, but we look forward to days when that can come back again. I think we've come to the end of our questions, so I'm going to send an extremely warm and kind thank you to you all for your time this evening. And again, Alex, particularly for playing with us earlier. And thank you all for joining us on our YouTube channel. If you would like to know more about NMC, sign up to our mailing list and we will send you information and news and special offers and goodness knows what else. But for now, I send all our best wishes from everyone at NMC to you all, and look forward to next time when you can join us for NMC Listening Club. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.